This address, Evangelism in the Broken Public Square. And you'll see that it says here that we are living in OB Day +1. OB stands for Original Brexit. So this was the day, meant to be the first 24 hours in which we were living in a new world. OB Day +1. The public square, I'll say this works now. Yes, the public square is broken. There are 4 pictures here. One says, "Stop this Brexit mess," which is from the huge demonstration. One below says, "Full metal Brexit now, remain lost." The one on the top right says, "Refugees are not welcome, and we are full." And the one at the bottom says, "Stop racist attacks and fascism." The public square is broken. Civilized and communal discourse is at risk. This is not a function of our own nation only. But in 2016, when we chose in this nation to become a plebiscite democracy, we saw the public square fragment. In the United States, when President Trump was elected, the public square had fragmented, and you have seen, both in America with the Mueller inquiry, and here with some of the inquiries that have gone on around vote leave, you have seen that the effect of social media and of the fragmentation of the public square has, according to many, been baleful. Conversation is broken. People are expressing anger to one another rather than listening. That's happening more and more, and the church is not exempt from it. So we tend to live in little bubbles, in social media in particular. It's always been the case, of course, that the newspapers that people bought in the days when they bought newspapers reflected their own politics. So that in a sense it's always been like this, but it does seem to me that this has increased. We live in a world, I've not used the phrase fake news, because I don't value that phrase given where it came from. But we live in a world of broken truth. So one will say to someone else what one believes to be facts, but the facts will bounce off that person's belief shield. And of course we need to be self-critical and to see the extent to which the same thing is true. And that people will try to communicate what they believe to be factual, and we will simply not believe it, because it does not fit with what we have already decided. Truth is broken. Places like this, academies, which are designed to teach young people the skills needed for civil discourse, have a harder and harder job, because the young people themselves find it all too easy to immerse themselves in bubbles of truth. And the concept of being able to learn from others, the kind of mutual listening which we were engaged in when we spoke earlier around the Liverpool North motion, these things are at a discount in the world. Morale is broken. So people withdraw from the public square. And over Brexit in particular, as you know, there is a profound weariness, as if people cannot be bothered yet again to turn on the news, to see yet again the withdrawal agreement coming before Parliament for a vote. As if somehow the contempt we feel for those who have been elected to lead us is so substantial that we no longer can be bothered to listen to them. Morale in terms of our wish to contribute as members of this nation is broken, and so we withdraw. My aunt, who's 95 years old, voted for Brexit because the Sun newspaper said that the Queen backs Brexit. It was a lie. We don't know what the Queen thinks about Brexit, because she's a constitutional monarch who makes it her business never to let on what she thinks. It's a lie, but it was published, and she believed it, my aunt, and so she voted in accordance with that. And now when you talk to her, she's 95, like anyone 95 years old, she's facing eternity. She says, "I can't be bothered to think about it." And then she quotes her own mother, "Don't ever talk about religion and politics, or you'll fall out." Morale is broken. And in all that, what is the voice of faith? Colleagues may not be able to read. On the left-hand side, there's a man who was photographed yesterday outside the House of Commons. His banner says, "Nigel Farage was sent by Christ to get Britain out of Europe and fulfill Bible prophecy." I'm sure many of you will be preaching on that tomorrow. The other figure here is Cardinal Reinhold Marx, a German cardinal, who is perceived by many as an advocate for the European Union. That's why his staff has got all these stars on the top of it. The voice of faith it tries to be hijacked by people who want, as a direct read across from their reading of the Scripture, to make their minds up about the issues of the day. So you will find in the United States large numbers, the most loyal single group of people who support the present president are white evangelicals by their own definition. I'm a white evangelical, therefore, like 85% of the people who call themselves that, I will support Donald Trump. Franklin Graham has said, in answer to the question, is there anything this president can do that would make you not support him? He has said no. The place of faith for those people automatically leads you to join the Republican Party and to vote for that president. On the other hand, as we know, it's easier to look abroad than it is to look on our own doorstep. That many churches, so-called mainline Protestant churches in the United States, have policies which in large measure coincide with the policies of the Democratic Party. In this country, things are more complicated than that, but candidly not much more complicated. Here in this room, we see people who hold all the spectrum of views on Brexit, but we see people too who sit together as Christians together in the same room. Being together in the same room while holding different views is one of the things that Christians are called to do. And therefore the Church of England's Together initiative, which the Archbishop of Canterbury expressed as, can we just invite people to sit down and have a cup of tea together, is an important contribution of the Church to a divided nation. But it is not the only contribution. And I want to say to you, friends, that if you're involved in the Together initiative, I commend you for being that I hope that what will happen is that people really will come to have a cup of tea together who would not normally talk to each other about matters of politics. That people might thereby learn from one another, but that it is not the sole role of the Church of God to be an independent arbiter of political difference. It is not the sole role of Christian people never to have an opinion. Sometimes in the exaltation of the idea of reconciliation, we can come to believe that our job is to be some sort of independent chair of a nation which is falling out. Whereas in fact we are citizens, not only of the heavenly city, but of this nation also. And so being together over a cup of tea is necessary, but it is not sufficient if we are to be Christians in this broken public square. What we need to bring, in addition to reconciliation, is evangelism. In our rule of life we say that we're called by God to pray and read and learn, and we're sent by God to tell and serve and give. We are sent by God to tell. And into this broken Britain, and into our own place as Christians, there comes the Holy Scripture, and in particular a verse which has always meant a huge amount to me in the context of evangelism, from 1 Peter chapter 3, where the apostle says, do not fear what they fear, and do not be intimidated, but in your hearts sanctify Christ as Lord. And then goes on to say, verse 15, always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and reverence. Hans-Rudi Weber, who used to work for the World Council of Churches, produced a book called Experiments in Bible Study. And in that book he has a chapter about this verse. He used to sit down with Christians and read the verse, and then he would say to them, how does evangelism happen then? And the Christians would say almost always, well, you go and tell people about Jesus. And Weber would have to read the verse again. Because if you read the verse, you will see that you're not going to tell people about Jesus. What you're going to be is ready with an explanation if anyone demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. My own translation, always be ready with an explanation for those who ask you why it is that you are so hopeful. So friends, we're going to die, and after we die, we're going to heaven. We do not fear what many in the nation fear. We believe that God is sovereign, and that greater is he who is in us than the one who is in the world. And therefore the fragmentation of our nation is not fundamentally something that should frighten us. Do not fear what they fear. But if we're to be unafraid, then simply being a chairperson for conversations between those who have an opinion is not sufficient, because we believe in Jesus. And we should be ready, in that context of a cup of tea, to make a defense for the fact that we believe not that Brexit is the final word, or that Remain is the final word, but that Jesus is the final word, and that in Jesus we can find a solution to the problem of our own lives, or we can enter into a mystery which brings us resolution about our own lives. I'm going very briefly now to go through with you something which some of you may have seen before. In May 2015, so before the Brexit vote, and before Brexit was even a twinkle in the eye of David Cameron, there was research done in Liverpool, in Church Street, by a number of commercial researchers. Primarily the outfit called Modicum, and another outfit called Quall Street. These are people whose normal day job is to work with commercial companies to listen to what England might be saying, for example, about tea bags or about toilet paper. But we gave them the opportunity to find out what England was saying about God. And about Jesus. And they did this research as independent people, talking to people who were not Christians. And they found that lots of people talk about Jesus. Indeed, this is 2015. In the week that they did the research, Andy Murray, who just won the Australian Open, got 58,000 mentions. But Jesus got 54,000. And David Cameron got 50,000, and so on down. Anybody remember Suarez? Even in those days, he only got 13,000. However, one of the reasons Jesus is mentioned is that Jesus is a swear word, and that when people write Jesus Christ, it appears in the statistics every bit as much as if they write, I follow Jesus. So you won't be able to read this clearly here, but it says Jesus banned from Marks and Spencer's flowers. Because there's an online thing that you can do to have a card with the flowers that you order online from Marks and Spencer to be delivered. But if you write, Happy Easter, Jesus is risen, the software would not allow you to use that, because they assumed that whenever the word Jesus or the word Christ appeared, it would be an oath. And therefore it was banned. I say that to you because this is the England which went on to become the Brexit England in which we now live. So the researchers of whom I've spoken asked the question, could you agree that Jesus is a role model for you? Someone who lived his life in the right way and changed the world. Regular churchgoers, 77%. You may think, friends, what about the other 24%? Regular churchgoers, 77% thought they could agree with that. Occasionals, 42%. People who said they were spiritual but not religious, about a third. People who were Christian in name only 8%. And those of no religion, only 3% believe that Jesus was a role model. I've said this to a number of you over the years since this research was done. 10 years before, people would say, we believe in Jesus, but we don't believe in the church, because the church doesn't follow Jesus. But now, or in 2015, people don't know who Jesus is, so they work out who Jesus is from us. They work on the basis, here are the people who follow Jesus, so if they're following, then Jesus must think as they do. And on that basis they find Jesus difficult. Jesus is difficult. Christianity, and this research was done in Church Street, Liverpool, with people, working class people between 18 and 40 years old. Christianity, if they were asked, what's Christianity all about? Does it mean anything? What does it mean? People just scratch their heads because to them, the doctrines of the Christian faith looked rather like this. Jesus is difficult, and Christianity is complicated. So that if we say to the world, come and have a cup of tea, think, why should I sit down with Jesus or with Jesus' people and listen to complicated things that I can't understand? We need to be clear about our evangelism, what the challenges are that face it. God, on the other hand, is simple. So when these Scousers were asked, what do you think about God? They would say, oh, God is great. I like God. Well, who is God? Well, we don't know who God is, but God makes sense of everything. And then the language they used was about silence and stillness and space and beauty. God is simple. But in the minds of these people down there on Church Street, Jesus and Christianity didn't have much to do with God. It's that which produces the phrase, spiritual but not religious, which so many people use to this day, but certainly used at this time. And then they were asked two things. Well, one thing really, what is it that you want then from the church? Is there anything you want from the church, given what you've just said? And they answered in two ways, and I could, if I had time, I don't have time, play the film clips which were done. These were focus groups with people and interviews in the street. I could play you some of these that indicate very clearly that what people want, if they're parents, they want their children to know about God and about the faith, the Christian faith, and if they are near a church or whenever they see a church, they want to pop in. They want their children to know and they want to pop in. People are enormously grateful for the fact that many of our churches are open. When I had the national job, the national mission evangelism job, we found that a staggering, and we tested it twice because we couldn't believe it, 85% of people then in the nation popped into church at least once a year to sit quietly. So if you're just wondering in your church council whether or not you should keep the church open, then I advise you to go for it and keep the church open, leaving aside the advice from the Ecclesiastical Insurance Office that actually it's safer open in many contexts, not all, I do understand. And then, so here we go, I'll just walk through there again. The third and final thing, and this is one up from the bottom here, is that people were and remain grateful for the social action of the church. In the Diocese of Liverpool, we say, we're asking God for a bigger church to make a bigger difference. And it looks therefore as though we want the bigger church so that the bigger difference can be made. But what people tell you in Church Street is that it's the bigger difference that will make the church bigger. Because by committing itself to justice, the church commends itself and commends Jesus to people who are otherwise suspicious. And the bottom line here says heart first, not head first. We showed the actual clips. I can't show them today. And there's a lovely Scouse woman who's asked the question, if you met a priest, what would you ask the priest? And the woman says, well, I'd ask him about the dinosaurs. So the researcher says, well, what about the dinosaurs? And the woman says, well, the dinosaurs don't appear in the Bible, but we all know they're real, so that disproves everything, doesn't it? And we played that to a group of Christian ministers, and one of them said, well, that's obvious then what we've got to do. We've got to get out there on the street and tell the world it's wrong about the dinosaurs. And very gently we had to explain to that person that that is not the way to commend the Christian faith to God. What matters is the heart, and the head follows. I'm not saying the head is unimportant, but the royal road to people's commitment is the road of love. And so they gave us, the researchers who we paid, they gave us 4, and these are not, what I'm going to show you now are not finished posters to be put up in churches, but 4 suggestions as to what the church might want to do in order to be evangelistic. Number one, why don't you say to the world, now it's time for the Church of England to act. Support the Church of England's fight against poverty and injustice. Because we know that if people believe that we stand up for the poor and those on the edge of things, then that is commendable in their eyes. Now is the time for the Church of England to act. That is a quote, of course, apart from the Church of England. Now it is time for God to act. A line from the 119th Psalm, which is used in the liturgy of the Orthodox Church. The deacon says it just before communion. Now it is time for God to act. Support its fight against poverty and injustice. If you are to convene a cup of tea for people, they need to know that because of Jesus, we stick up for those on the edge of things. We do not exclude people on the edge of things. We welcome people so that they may be honoured. Time to act. And secondly, an open church. Churches want to reopen their doors, to be there when you need time to pray, to think, to be with God, or to think of your loved ones who've passed on. These were things that non-Christian researchers brought to us. Having spoken to non-Christian people, they said, why don't you open the church? It's your biggest asset. Jeremy was talking about the heritage. The heritage can be an evangelistic thing, and Mike was quite right to say that in the deaneries, you need not to say, we're having this church, then we're going to lock it so the Christians can have a great time for an hour a week. But this building can actually tell people about Jesus in ways that they want to hear. And thirdly, just to cash in on the thing about children, bring your little ones after school or at the weekend for making things, learning, singing, storytelling. Now friends, we're good at this. Messy Church is an ideal way forward on this, and it meets England where it is. And then finally this one, peaceful prayer services. Take half an hour to come to church to pray in peace alongside others. I can't remember, it's St. Bride's, someone's doing this thing to say, we're going to have just a half an hour service. I don't even know, it might not be in our diocese, but a church is saying, we're going to have a sort of very brief service, perhaps in a shopping mall or something, where people can just sit and be quiet together. Why? Because they've told us that's what they want. And so we put it to these people, out of all these 4 ideas, take action, open your church, family-friendly, peaceful prayer, what do you think is the most important one? The regulars in church, of course, more of them thought it was good. But from the regulars, they thought that taking action and opening churches was the key thing. The occasionals thought the same thing, but key point is that the no-religion people and those Christians in name only also saw social justice as the royal road to evangelism. So I share that with you, if I can. That was the end of the research. I share that with you because of this verse from Scripture. Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you, but do it with gentleness and reverence. Now, as Keith knows, who gave the Diocesan Synod report, and as a General Synod report, and as all our General Synod members know, in the General Synod we majored, this last one, on evangelism. And one of the things the Archbishop of Canterbury asked the Synod to do, which was not necessarily greeted with great delight by the Synod, but I'm going to ask you to do it in a minute, so brace yourselves, was to see if you could say, in 1 minute, without any jargon, what you believe. Can you say, in 1 minute, without any jargon, what you believe? So, there it is, 1 minute, no jargon. And what I'd like you to do for a minute, before we pray together and this presidential address comes to an end, is to answer this question for yourself. If someone asked you to account for the hope that is in you, today, in this fragmented England, where we don't know where we're going with Brexit, where things seem unloving, where unemployment now from a historically low point is beginning once again to rise, where people are anxious and some of them are sick. In such an England, if someone said to you, "Why are you so hopeful?" what would you say? 1 minute, no jargon. What I'd like you to do first, before you turn to your neighbour, which inevitably you're going to be asked to do, is to think to yourself about the answer to that question. It's as if someone telephoned you and said, "I'm coming round to talk to you in a minute, and I'm going to ask you in a minute what you think about hope and why you're so hopeful. Can you tell me?" And I want you to imagine that this person isn't a church person, doesn't have any Christian words. What would you say? Because we need to say this. We're sent to tell. And if we don't know the answer, we're stumped. In this England, we know what the problems are. And we know from research what interests people about our faith. And we're called to pray and read and learn, and we're sent to tell and serve and give. And my hope is not only for the members of the synod, but for the diocese, that we can be a resource in this broken Britain, which doesn't just come from our making a cup of tea, but which comes from our speaking of Jesus. I commend to you the practice. There's something to be practiced of talking about your faith, so that when someone asks, you can answer.